Hey, John.
Hello,
Hi.
welcome.
How are you?
Good, thanks.
I invited my friend. I don't know if she's going to come, and I don't know if that was okay, but there it is.
Sure, that's fine.
Okay. I figured.
Great. So as people come on, I will get started, and then I'll just ask everyone to turn off their mics, and I will begin sharing my screen shortly, as I have a bit of a presentation worked up for today. What I'm going to be focused on today first is presenting a formula that I created in response to something that was brought to my attention several months ago in regards to female reproductive system. So I'll be going into the rationale behind that, and then see where we can go from there with what time we may have left. But yes, the main objective of these weekly meetings is to bring to light certain aspects of our product line to help guide people to make empowered choices, and address particular concerns or interests or questions that people might have week to week. If you send emails in, I might be able to consider what you're interested in to help direct attention towards particular products, or help me flesh out more of the rationale behind the products, or different concerns, applications that can be addressed via our products. All right, so I know a lot of people just jump on the recording later, so I'm going to get started now by screen sharing. I don't have anyone helping today, so simply typing questions in the chat, and then I'll pop over there when I can to have a look at it. All right. Again, this is the purpose of this presentation, is to empower individuals to make choices on behalf of their own health, their family's health, or people that have entrusted their help to. And that's the premise on which I began this company over 15 years ago, is to bring the medicines from the desert, from the mountains, to the people. And things have been evolving from there, but that's still the fundamental rationale, to reconnect people with nature, and to empower individuals to make their own choices for their health, and help people become more aware of what the plant world has to offer, which is exceptionally potent and powerful. So I'll see if I can tap into that well for you today by discussing this uterine formula that I created. So this is going to be the main topic of discussion today, as I don't believe many people are aware of this product yet. And so that's one of the ways I want to utilize these meetings as an opportunity to help bring awareness to what we're making. Okay, so this formula, like all of the formulas that are on our website, have been a product of my studies as an herbalist, both you could say studies of the literature, whether that's ethnobotany or scientific literature in terms of studies, or my studies of nature and my studies of humans within nature in relationship to plants. So that is the foundation for where this formula comes from, looking at a phenomenon and then that is present within humans, i.e. dysregulation, disease, illness, a pattern, something that's emerging from the human population, that I'm either witnessing personally, or I'm reading about, or hearing other people talk about. And coupling that, what I tend to do as a vitalist, bioregional herbalist, is then first relate to my personal experiences, relate to my knowledge base, my experiential knowledge base in relationship to the plants that I've worked with, in relationship to the natural landscape. For those of you who have perhaps been on plant walks with me or intensive bioregional herbalist immersion classes, workshops, or programs, you'd be aware that that's my approach in general. And so I tend to rely upon that or extract information from that, even in the creation of these products. So that's definitely strongly present here in this uterine formula. So those three ingredients, ocotillo, desert cottonroot, and destafiate. I didn't bother to put the scientific names up there, but I can tell you about those as we go. So all three of those plants occur locally. Two of them, in fact, now I am growing in my own native plant food and medicine garden that's mostly watered by rainfall. And these are relatively abundant, locally available wild medicines. So ocotillo is Fouquiera splendens. That's the only only species of this genus, of this family, that we find growing in the US. But over the border into Mexico, there are other related species, but this is the primary, far and away primary species for medicine. And thankfully, it is robustly abundant from Southern California to West Texas. And so desert cottonroot, the second ingredient in this formula, this is even more specific for the female reproductive system. This is a Gossypium thurberi, closely related to cultivated cotton. But this cotton is a native wild cotton of the Sonoran Desert. So a little more exclusive in its range, can be found in central down to southeastern Arizona and into northern Mexico. So generally it's the young root or the root bark of this plant, although I also work with the stem or stem bark, which has a slightly different energy to it, a little more detoxifying, cooling, more potent anti-inflammatory action. And I will talk about desert cotton more specifically as we go. And then estafiate, many people are not familiar with that name. You can also call it Western mugwort. It's one of our native Artemisia species, Artemisia ludoviciana. It's our major Artemisia at the low elevations of the desert, but it's also present throughout the West in both mid and upper elevation locales, and also found in prairies. In fact, it was the most commonly named medicinal plant amongst indigenous people who were interviewed by anthropologists, ethnobotanists of the late 19th century throughout the shortgrass prairie for all the uses they have of it. So that's a plant that I will use in many, many circumstances, but it does have an affinity for the female reproductive system, as do other Artemisia species. And also a close affinity, very close affinity for the liver. And the liver regulates blood flow, and blood flow is, of course, essential to all organs, but is intimately connected with female reproductive as well. Okay, so what are the properties of this formula that I put together? Looking at it being anti-inflammatory to the uterus, and that's a contribution, I would say, primarily from estafiate and desert cottonroot, but then also indirectly from ocotillo. And then enhancing blood flow to the reproductive organs. So that's a very important factor there. Restriction due to the condition of the connective tissue can be a significant issue with female reproductive issues. So estafiate has that capacity to regulate the tension of the ligaments and tendons in particular with a particular affinity for the uterus, such that blood flow, proper blood flow, can return and be restored. And Ocotillo contributes here indirectly, you could say, because of its very subtle pumping, almost like hydraulic action on the lymphatics of the pelvic region, such that if there's stagnation and pooling of blood, resulting in a cooling effect, which has, when I say the word cooling, has implications towards stagnancy, less movement, and therefore less warmth, less blood flow, less nutrient delivery, and less toxin or waste product extraction. So therefore, I see Ocotillo indirectly enhancing blood flow to the reproductive organs. And then as I was just describing, Ocotillo is directly responsible for improving the pelvic lymphatic flow. And I believe the other two herbs would also do that to some extent as well. Anodyne is a term that means pain relieving. And so that refers to Estafillate and possibly desert cottonroot. The way that I'm breaking down this formula is compartmentalized, and that's at the origins of creating a formula. I would say, in its rational approach, that's essentially how it works. That's how I understand it. And over time, a formula can take on an energy, persona, you might say, a nature of its own, take on its own nature. So that's where I'm at right now in terms of understanding this formula and seeing how this plays out in women. But each of these herbs, I have experience observing how these herbs affect female reproductive system, secondhand, obviously, but through a lot of feedback from people, and of course what other herbalists have written about it. So I have strong reason to believe that these three will work really well together. And it's not the first time that I've used them together, for that matter. And so in that regard, I do understand that there's an enhanced vitality that comes in particular in relationship to the female reproductive system and the pelvic region in general, that may overflow into psychospiritual aspects of the individual. For example, there have been reports from women using Ocotillo tincture due to, I guess, maybe just pelvic stagnation was the initial draw or the rationale to use it as a remedy. And maybe they had some prescience of these other aspects or not, I'm not sure. But in time, through using the Ocotillo, they experienced an increased sensation throughout their pelvic region, such that they were able to orgasm during sexual intercourse with their partner, whereas previously they were unable to, had extreme difficulty with that, and or experience a heightened degree of orgasm because of the opening and enhanced sensitivity that they experienced through the use of the Ocotillo. So that's really amazing. What we're looking at essentially is, I would imagine, peeling away the layers of some sort of psycho-emotional trauma that has been stored in the tissues. So that's one of the ways that herbs are phenomenal as healing agents of nature, that we are essentially hesitate to say made to be in alignment with, but I don't have a better way to say it at this time. But through our awakening unto other aspects of nature that come in touch with our being, we can reawaken to the truer nature of ourselves. And so that's a simple way of stating how herbs affect the body. Yes, we have biochemical models that have been established for, first through observing natural phenomena, and then through experimentation, setting up circumstances with synthetic molecules to repeat what was observed in nature, and then establish a predictable, repeatable pattern, and therefore somewhat, at least somewhat predictable and repeatable pattern, and therefore we get the groundwork for pharmaceutical medications. And there can be deviations from that predictable and repeatable pattern, and we apply things differently, or we have additional effects, aka side effects, that occur. Whereas with herbs, the uncovering of their nature or their effects is by and large an aspect of a reawakening to our own nature, becoming aware of the sensations in our body that may be elicited by the plants. It's not to say that a plant can't do something that's incorrect for our nature, but I might be getting too long-winded here. But just to speak on the differences between a biochemical approach and integrating the natural potency or the nature of an herb with our bodies. And so that's a very distinct difference in conceptual, in concept, almost two different realities, as a matter of fact, that is kind of at the crux of what we're looking at right here. So therefore we have agents of nature that can enhance the vitality of these reproductive organs, as opposed to something that is targeting a specific biochemical response that we are intending to control from a higher level, a perceived higher level, an intellectual higher level. Whereas the taking of the herbs through some sense of innate wisdom and understanding at the heart level, while also coupled with our intellectual, rational understanding, as I'm attempting to present somewhat loosely, is a means of reacquainting ourselves with our truer nature, as opposed to overlaying that with a hyperimposed, intellectualized, compartmentalized approach, which is the pharmaceutical approach, and I believe is inherently limited. So one last thing to mention about this formula is would be contraindicated in pregnancy because of the potential irritating effects on the uterus by desert cottonroot and the staphyate in particular. It's not to say that these three herbs should be avoided entirely during pregnancy, although I think I can't think of a good reason to use any of them in the first trimester, because that's the most sensitive time, but could be reason to utilize them at smaller doses later in the pregnancy without the expressed intent of inducing labor, inducing contractions. But I'm not going to get into that today. I just want to state that I have an open mind in terms of how herbs can be utilized during pregnancy, especially when they assist in the mother's well-being, emotionally, psychospiritually, primarily, because that's the most important thing. One could argue, aside from nutrition, for the health of the baby, that if a mother can receive benefit and experience a deeper sense of calm, for example, from taking herbs that might otherwise be considered somewhat potentially irritating or marginally so to the uterus, I think I would favor utilizing those herbs if the benefit is there for the woman. Whereas, like I mentioned, these have some, desert cotton can be an herb used, or cotton root for that matter, can be an herb used in the labor process. It's an oxytocin synergist. So it does have a potential, influence on the letdown reflex and the contracting of the uterus, such that you wouldn't want to just be taking that for a quote healthy uterus in your second trimester or in month 7 or 8. It's not prudent. But let me let me just leave it at that for now. And next, we're going to go into the rationale for this. Why did I want to create a formula for a healthy uterus, or to support and protect a uterus? Now, I've been focusing somewhat on the reproductive years in relation to this discussion, but I would say that this formula could apply to potentially those later years of adolescence, or postmenopausal, in relation to where I'm about to go with this. So without further ado, I'll move the slide forward. So protecting the female reproductive system, and I'm looking at two particular things: syncytia and a placental development, and syncytia as a spike protein. So this, I think I first became aware of this maybe in April or May, possibly earlier, but so much information I've taken in, it's hard to place it all in a timeline. But I do understand that publicly this was first being discussed at least as early as December 1st of 2020 as a concern prior to the rollout of the COVID injections. So what we're going to look at today is what the possibility is, or the proposed possibilities of this syncytia. We'll describe what that is and what this syncytia may be doing potentially within the uterus. So if we were having this discussion a year ago, this would certainly be much more on the theoretical, hypothetical, in that arena of debate. Although I've looked at some studies which claim to refute this possibility, what stands nonetheless are a great number, at this point likely tens of thousands, if not more, of women who have suffered, if not miscarriages, abnormal bleeding, and sudden infertility. And when I say sudden infertility, that might sound a bit implausible to suspect or prove, for that matter. But for example, women who were not actively reproducing themselves, but donating their eggs to fertility centers, and then suddenly after receiving the COVID injection, they no longer were able to produce eggs, viable eggs. So, and then similar things have been reported for males as well, but I'm not getting into that in this presentation. So let's have a look at what syncytia is. Oh, sorry, this is what I was just describing. But yeah, in addition to the excessive bleeding, general menstrual dysregulation, genital rash, severe genital rash for both females and males, and then vaginal bleeding has been reported pre-menarche, prior to onset of menses, from in fact some really young ages, and postmenopausal as well, which is not entirely unheard of in and of itself, but these individual cases were reported from, this was reported from individuals in many circumstances in which this was highly unusual. And there was a correlated exposure to recently vaccinated individuals. And so what could that possibly mean? So not sure whom I may be speaking to here, or what your orientation is, but what has been reported is that the transmission of lipid nanoparticles, or whatever it might be, spike proteins, it's conceivable, if not expected, that once released throughout the body, that these could be passed through skin-to-skin contact. And this is referred to in Pfizer's documentation, and the FDA wrote a paper about it a few years ago, about lipid nanoparticle technology and this concept of, quote, transmission. I don't know if that's the proper term, or who's to say what the proper term is, but nonetheless, that is something that is reported, and it's a technology that has been established through animal models already, through both mice in laboratory conditions, as well as it's been utilized on wild horse populations. For example, here in Arizona, wild horse populations have been inoculated, I believe, from helicopter through shooting syringes from rifles into some of the lead mares in these wild horse populations, and then through their normal interactions, physical interactions, it's meant to, these lipid nanoparticles are meant to spread across the populations. And in both the horse and the mouse models, these were infertility experiments, or these attempts to eradicate the horse populations. So let's just say, suffice to say, that a self-spreading vaccine, so to speak, has been established in mammalian populations with effectiveness, and these COVID injections do carry a risk, a reported risk of risk. Is it? I consider it a risk. They don't really describe it succinctly or distinctly as a risk, but it certainly can be seen that way from one individual to the next, regardless of their individual or regardless of the secondary individual's status, whether they've been vaccinated or not, that these nanoparticles can spread. Right. Okay. So that's the reality as I see it, regardless of what tests have been conducted to refute it. And so my role is to listen to what people say that they're experiencing. If you come to me for a private consultation and you tell me you're experiencing something that you don't have, quote, documented proof of, or that the system hasn't documented your subjective experience through the lens of their quantitative assessments, I certainly will not throw that out. In fact, probably more often than not, people will come to me for private consultation because their experiences have not been regarded as authentic by the medical establishment. And I've been working with people, I began working with people with Lyme disease over 15 years ago that were completely disregarded by the medical system. And so that's not uncommon, it's not new, it's been around for a long time. So whether this is accepted or not, to me, by the scientific community or medical establishment is irrelevant. But let's move on. Okay, so how does this happen? Well, I kind of hinted at this already, but let's get into some of the nuts and bolts of this, and hopefully you find this interesting. But this is, if nothing else, to help you understand where I'm coming from in regards to why I created this formula. So if SARS-CoV-2 is derived from retroviruses, which some claim that it is, including Judy Mikovits, composed of different viruses, some of them retroviruses, this might be the scenario. So syncytin, what is syncytin? Syncytin is, you could say, syncytia, or what are syncytia? Syncytia are fused cells from, so it's like this clump of cells from retroviral envelopes. And I can't see the rest of what I wrote here because it's being covered and I don't have access to my cursor. I think I know what it says, and are triggered to develop the release of syncytin. So this is, since syncytia are found not just within the uterus, but elsewhere in the body. In fact, they form an envelope of cells around the heart as well. So I'm not making any claims, but I'm curious what that has to do with pericarditis. You know, the most common, it seems, ailment amongst adolescents who have received the injection. Okay, and syncytin is a retroviral envelope protein. So this is documented science. This is not anything that really anyone disputes, but it's a fascinating phenomenon. It's claimed that there's two different types that are claimed to be in our genome going back 25,000 to 40,000 years, if I remember correctly, and HERVW. So that's a human something retrovirus. And maybe it's human enveloped retrovirus, class W. There's different HERVs. And that's present in the development of the placenta as the fused ovum and sperm now seek to fuse to the endometrium, these trophoblasts as they're called. This merger is initiated through the release of syncytin. So think about that for a second. It's kind of fascinating that we have an envelope protein that comes from a retrovirus that has now, it's within our own so-called human endogenous retrovirus. That's what it stands for, HERV. We now refer to it as endogenous, but presumably this came from elsewhere. Where it came from, how we got it, how we adapted it, and why is fascinating to ponder, even if they're saying that that time frame is correct, 25,000, 40,000 years ago. Like, what about prior to that? Because this, what this is doing is essentially preventing our immune system from attacking the egg, preventing it from being, or as it attaches to the endometrium, and preventing it from growing. So a healthy immune system would immediately identify and suspend and attack this agglutination of cells coming together in a mass, i.e. a tumor. So effectively, it's a prevention of tumor growth. Yet we have the ability and the intelligence at the cellular level to express this protein that will, you could say, protect that or help trigger that fusion, to initiate and allow that fusion to happen. Okay, so that's where syncytin is relevant in relationship to placental development. Okay, and what we're talking about here with the uterus and potential uterine irritants, what might that be? So spike proteins also contain syncytin homologous proteins, which are essential for the development of the placenta in mammals such as humans. Okay, so does that mean that spike proteins are the same thing as syncytin? I'm not accomplished well enough to say. I've heard people such as Judy Mikovits state that spike protein is syncytin, but they're not exactly identical from what I understand. That they share a few amino acid sequences, and there's a similarity in appearance and function to some extent. But the spike proteins are larger, maybe have several different formations, the S1, S2, and other proteins that are present that are significantly larger than the syncytin. But what was initially expressed in December of 2020 by Michael Yeadon is that these would potentially initiate an immune reaction, i.e. the synthetic spike protein that is created through the programming by the injected mRNA via the lipid nanoparticle into our cell structure. And so the spike proteins being created from that may be antagonist to the syncytia, or the release of syncytia for that matter, within the endometrium. So I think that's possible. I think another possibility too, and I actually lean this way a little bit more, is that these spike proteins, and this is where the passage through skin contact is potentially relevant, encased in lipid nanoparticles, that if that is passed from skin to skin, could that migrate to the uterus? Quick side note, one of the tissues where the migration that wasn't expected, it was all expected to stay in the deltoid muscle, although there's information that shows that that was a very false expectation, and that we had prior knowledge to expect it would move throughout the body. And that's part of what this technology is made for, to move throughout the body and go to target organs. Nonetheless, the Pfizer study in Japan showed that there was a high concentration in the ovaries of the spike protein. Probably second only to the lymphatic tissue, but that's perhaps because the lymphatic tissue was the primary carrier, and the interstitial area of the fluids of the body. That's one of the reasons why I've been talking about CB3 formulas being important, along with red root, to clear that interstitial space. But the spike protein concentrating within the ovaries, and perhaps then within the uterus, and perhaps then not allowing for the syncytia to dock in those places where it would initiate the fusion of the egg to the endometrium, causing eggs to bounce off when they might otherwise, if the timing is right, where that process, where a woman is at that process stage of the process of developing life, or if it's already attached, disabling that attachment somehow, because I believe the syncytin is still important even once the placenta is attached, even into later first into second and third trimesters. So could it be interfering with that? There's probably multiple things happening from what I understand. Okay. Now, another thing that's interesting to note is hypoxia is a common pathological trait in diseases affecting placental tissue, which affects expression. So hypoxia is a common pathological trait. Syncytin-1 is downregulation is commonly observed in diseased placentas. So how could it be downregulated? Well, there could be an immune response that downregulates that, or could be through receptors taking up that space, that now we think there's enough, the body might register there's enough of it, we don't need to make it less downregulated. That could happen possibly in a very short period of time. So hypoxia, well, that's a condition that we're experiencing not just in the lungs, but all throughout the red blood vessels, lowered oxygen carrying capacity. So there's something within that seems to me to indicate the relevance of spike protein, and how the phenomena of this protein molecule, or this protein and its effects on our immune system are correlative with what we're seeing here. And syncytin is also involved in tumor formation in reproductive organ cancers. So how does that, this is, if one has any inclinations towards dyslexia, this can become, a lot of these things can become very confusing quickly. So it's not so much like syncytin good, syncytin bad. Syncytin, like most things, could have multiple roles. So yes, it's good in the sense that, like, we have this release within the uterus due to the presence of this retrovirus in our endogenous virome, that then allows for implantation to take place, and the life can be grown. Otherwise, none of us would be here without syncytin. Yet also, perhaps its overexpression may be involved with tumor formation. So if something is repressed for long enough, could it then resort to overexpression in a later stage? I see that as possible. I don't know if or where this is being discussed in the scientific literature, but these are just some of my thoughts. And so what I do know, though, is that one Dr. Ryan Cole, who also runs a lab in Idaho, he has reported several months ago, goodness, what it was a significant, I don't want to throw numbers out there, but many times over increase in endometrial cancers, many times over. I want to say like 25 times greater. It was some exponential growth that cannot just, it has to have some factor behind it. You know, it's one thing, oh, we got 10% more this year, 10% less, 25% more, whatever, you know, different composition of the patients coming in, or who knows what, but an exceptional parabolic move in the expression of endometrial cancers in his patient cohort, people that he serves. So is that also involved here? So that's another big question. That's something else that I'm pondering, and then have just some two brief thoughts on as we move through here. So I don't know if anyone has any questions, but if so, feel free to put them in the chat, and I can address that whenever I'm able to access the chat, since I don't really have the use of my cursor when I'm doing screen sharing. Okay, so that's what I was just referring to. This is what I was just referring to. I would like to put more time into this, but just wasn't available. But here we go. These are two of the medicinal mushrooms that we offer as extracts, chaga and reishi. Chaga is Inonotus obliquus. It grows on birch. I purchased chaga from a family who gathers in the woods in New York. And so it's sustainable harvest, healthy forest. Chaga derives compounds from, all polypores do derive from the host tree. So betulinic acid is a compound in birch bark, and it's also a compound that's been found in chaga. Both birch bark and chaga have been used traditionally to treat and heal cancers. And betulinic acid is a presumable is a compound that's presumably responsible for some of those effects, either inhibiting tumor growth or inducing apoptosis, so sudden cell death that helps reduce the growth of cancers and so forth. And so reishi is Ganoderma, also known as artist's conch or lingzi in Chinese medicine. Other names as well that I'm not thinking of right now, but Ganoderma is the genus, and several different species of Ganoderma can be used. I've used reishi from different sources, only occasionally wild. We don't see it here that much. I think I might have seen some growing on a dead canyon hackberry tree on a private plant walk that I did for a group last Sunday afternoon. So any of the polypores, in fact, are going to have some antioxidant and immune regulating activities. That's good to know. There's only one potentially toxic polypore I've heard about, and that's in Wisconsin, and its name I can't recall, but by and large, generally speaking, almost absolutely, polypores are non-toxic and have antioxidant properties and immune regulating properties. They're mushrooms that aren't eaten per se, they're woody, so we make teas out of them. And so both of our extracts, those are heat treated mushrooms. So the lignans, or the chitin that's in the mushrooms, that's a compound that's also found in cicada shells or in shrimp shells and other crustaceans. Very rigid molecule that resists being broken down in our digestive tract even. But heat will help break that down and release compounds that are held within. So we always use heat when making our mushroom extracts, and then add alcohol after the fact to help release polyphenols, which are also really important in terms of immune stimulation or immune regulation. So it's in addition to what I just said about syncytin's involvement with oncogenesis in reproductive organs. We also know that retroviruses can turn on oncogenes. So that, could kind of just overlap with what I just said in regards to syncytin, which is a protein released from a retrovirus. So that's maybe one mechanism by which a retrovirus can turn on oncogenes or genes that are inducive of or conducive to inducing cancer. And they can also turn off tumor suppressing genes, which is another aspect of the same thing, meaning that eliminates our defense system. So both chaga and reishi could be important allies in helping to address either side of that, because they may very well have epigenetic effects, especially when used long term. And we definitely know that vitamin D does. And I would say that alongside respiratory infections, or we can also just call it acute autoinflammatory, acute autoimmune inflammatory episodes of the respiratory tract, are almost impossible to come by if you have ample stores of vitamin D, i.e., minimum 40, but safe to say 50 nanograms per milliliter. And from studies that were done in the early 2000s, a model that was published by a doctor in UC San Diego, that essentially a cancer cannot develop without a vitamin D deficiency. I don't recall how we defined vitamin D deficiency at that time, but let's just say again, you'd have to fall at least below 30 or potentially below 40, but maybe more likely below 30 to begin to allow the further formation of tumor cells to agglutinate or concentrate in the body. Arguably, we all have tumor cells potentially forming in our bodies right now, but in a healthy state with an adequate response, we can disable that and excrete the waste. But through epigenetic influences, whether that's i.e. A retrovirus, or potentially a dysregulation of our immune system by a foreign agent, i.e. spike protein, those systems, those self-supporting, self-regulating systems can become dysregulated. So having ample vitamin D stores is a primary way of maintaining a regulated system, regardless of what we interact with. That could be a really tight way of saying it, also broadly addressing what I'm talking about here. And I would say probably serving a more minor role than vitamin D, because vitamin D is so broad in its effects. And yes, chaga and reishi are medicinal mushrooms, but maybe certainly not as effective in the broad scale sense of immune regulation and cancer prevention as adequate vitamin D, but still nonetheless very useful. If the first thing that I would recommend to anybody that was concerned about cancer or was dealing with a cancer diagnosis would be medicinal mushrooms. Probably as a tea, drinking the tea on a regular basis, because I think that on a daily basis, that's one of the best ways to acquire medicine from plants, is ingesting a tea. But keep in mind, our extracts are formed off of a tea. They're just more concentrated. And then the addition of alcohol, which draws out more constituents, but then also helps preserve its shelf life. So a tea, you're going to have to be making more regularly. And a lot of the mushroom powders, I believe if they're made correctly, that are on the market now, those are going to be water extractions that have then been dehydrated. You don't want just powdered chaga. That's it's not going to be broke. You aren't going to be able to extract much from that. It's a waste. So hopefully the products don't have that. I know a lot of products now are in fact ground mycelia, and hopefully you get a higher percentage of mycelia rather than just ground oats or rice or whatever else the substrate would be. So, you know, there's a number of different mushroom products out there right now, and that's what I would be looking towards, is making sure that the fruiting bodies or the mycelia, arguably sometimes the mycelia might work as well, but they're more purified and apart from what they might be growing on. That's what the substrate is. So ours are strictly fruiting bodies of chaga and reishi, nothing of the substrate, and it's a concentrated form. So secondary to making a tea of either of those, these would be my favorite. And that's what I do now on a daily basis, both the chaga and reishi. I like to do that in a morning cocoa drink. And then I'll add other herbs to that as well, like Bakel skullcap and chia or danshen, because pulling this background full circle, I've mentioned these, I think, on every presentation, but they're really important. And there was others I get to, but I just didn't have time to finish this up. But danshen, Bakel skullcap, two of the top herbs that I'm aware of. Kudzu is another one for blocking spike protein attachment. So if the theory is correct about how the irritation within the uterus is taking place, then an overall healthy atmosphere within the uterus would be primary, and then the specific actions of being able to block the spike protein would also be helpful. Could any of those three herbs, ocotillo, desert cotton, or estafiote, block the spike protein? I don't know. It's possible. That hasn't been studied in a laboratory under in vitro conditions, so I don't know. You know, and again, not again, but I must say it, even though things are demonstrated under in vitro conditions, doesn't mean that it works in our own bodies. You know, it's a related but separate thing. So that's something to keep in mind. And that's why I think it's so important to develop a relationship with one's own health. This is information to help support your own decisions. It isn't a track to plug into and to listen to unquestionably and assume that it's the only answer or the be all end all. I think what's most important is that when information that you receive resonates with your own felt experience in truth and integrity, with courage, that is the best information for you to implement. There's an aspect of also trusting what comes your way in a time of need. And it might also be a time for you to assert more independence and self-reliance and not take in information from others that is directing you in a different way. But that, again, is for each individual to determine, to ascertain, and to discern for themselves. I feel right now what's most important is that we are learning to discern effectively, and that will be an essential skill as a natural person on this planet, as a sovereign natural person, to be able to discern what before you is of benefit or of harm to yourself or your family, and all levels, and to relinquish our reliance upon expert outside sources that are to determine for us what is good and what is not good, or to direct our actions explicitly. Not to say that we shouldn't take in counsel, but a counsel that is taken without any regard to one's heart and one's higher awareness, I think is very short-sighted and is potentially in detriment to oneself, if not inherently in detriment to oneself, for the act of simply not allowing our cognizance to come from that centered place within ourselves. So hopefully that puts the information that I shared today into context, and I would appreciate any of your feedback or requests for, even if you're watching this as a recording later, any requests on specific products you'd like me to cover so you can learn more about it, or if you have specific concerns that I might be able to draw your attention to a specific product, that could also work. But those are the objectives of these weekly sessions. And also like to point out, I didn't have a chance to put a slide up, but I have just recently uploaded a stock of Osha tincture that I harvested myself in the wild over a year ago. Some of it has been macerating for over a year. So it's an excellent, really potent tincture, harvested, as I said, by myself with a lot of intention. That's phenomenal medicine for acute respiratory conditions, and also digestive ailments, and also to help increase blood flow to the uterus, consequently. And one other herb that I added as well, tincture of shepherd's purse, fresh plant tincture of shepherd's purse, which is an excellent first aid remedy for any internal bleeding. Consequently, another herb related to the birthing process, but it can also be utilized for any sort of genital urinary bleeding, and or prolapse, has a toning effect. So prolapse of the uterus, prolapse of the bladder as well. So those two tinctures, Osha, O-S-H-A, con acento, not all caps, Osha, even though they made a good decision to uphold the Fifth Circuit Court's appeal recently. That's not the Osha I'm talking about. And another Osha with integrity, that is our Ligusticum porteri, and shepherd's purse, Capsella bursa pastoris. So made from fresh, well-crafted shepherd's purse seeds. Okay, and then also just to make a quick announcement, we will be having our annual gratitude sale. That's going to be happening this weekend, starting Sunday at some point in time. I haven't programmed the sale yet. It'll be a 20% off sale, and that's going to be on all of the products, excluding books or my quick consultations. You may very well still be able to add those and receive the discount at checkout, but I will have to revert that because I just can't apply that sale to the books or the consultations. So that is excluding the books or consultations. You of course can purchase those at the same time, but they will be disqualified from receiving the discount. And in addition to that, why is it the gratitude sale? For one, it's the gratitude to you as our loyal customers for sticking with us for so long, however long you've been with us, some of you for many years, if not over a decade. So I really appreciate that. But also to those who have paved the way before me. So each of these annual sales, I contribute a portion of the revenue from these sales during this time frame of Sunday, November, what is that? I can't see because it's blocking, but this coming Sunday, whatever date that is, until Tuesday, the Giving Tuesday. So it'll end, I believe, on midnight Mountain Time on Tuesday. We'll take a percentage of those sales, and that'll be contributed to Doña Olga's family in Sonora. Doña Olga is the deceased mentor of mine, like a Mexican mom. She passed away a year and a half ago, and she was a phenomenal herbalist. And I'd like to support her legacy and her family. And I appreciate those who have continued to contribute donations on their behalf. I really appreciate that. And those are all going towards their needs and their future needs. I'm attempting to set them up as well as I can for whatever they may need in the future as well, assisting them with that. And I know that some of the donations recently went to purchasing medications for them when they the Doña Olga's daughters became ill. So we will also be open to donations directly and 100% for them. I will make that available on the email where you learned about this. So right now, I only have these available to our email subscribers. If you know anybody that would be interested in participating in this or getting the recording link, just have them go onto our website and sign up for the emails. And so this is about serving our loyal community at Desert Tortoise Botanicals. So we appreciate that. And again, if you have any questions in regards to possible presentations in the future, please send me an email. All right, thank you for your comments. And there's no questions today, so I'm going to wrap it up, and then shortly hereafter I'll get a recording and email that out to everyone. So next Thursday is Thanksgiving. I'm going to be with my family, so I won't be doing one of these sessions, but I plan to be back at it the following week. So there's 2 weeks for you to get in your requests if you have any. And thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.